The snow had a way of making promises and breaking them in the same breath. It softened the sound of a bootstep and sharpened the hunger at a child's ribs. It drew white curtains across fences and chimneys and left, on porches and window panes, the small, honest trace of who had passed that way. On the morning the story we tell begins, the world outside the town of Ashford was wrapped in that kind of hush, a pale, patient silence, with the smell of wood smoke rolling low and slow from every lean-to and chimney, and the evergreen scent, the faint, bright tang of pine boughs from every doorway where a branch had been pushed up to keep the wind from brushing freckled length from people's faces. Inside the little houses there were other sounds, a kettle's thin whistle, the scrape of a knife on a board, the steady thrum of a woman sewing by candlelight. Quilts were being patched with hands that had known the cold too many winters, and kettles kept the slow murmur of stew, the broth fat and golden from saved bits of meat. Children ran hot after errands and came back in, cheeks red and noses shining with a winter's courage. On many doors the same small wreath, boughs bound with red thread and a single sprig of holly, reminded folks that even in a year of thin flour and thinner coin, the household kept some hold of joy. In one such house lived Anna Mercer. She was not a woman of grand ambitions. She kept her hands busy and her face steady, and the people who knew her often said, in a way that made it plain they meant to praise, that Anna never wasted a thing. She braided the bread dough in a long, patient loop, tucking a sliver of orange peel or a scrap of cinnamon into the middle like a secret. She kept jars of preserves in a larder with straw, and when the frost came she brought down the last of the gathered apples and set them on the windowsill to look at the sky. She mended stockings by lamplight and tied little cloth dolls for the neighbors' children whose mother had taken to the convalescent house after a fever. People brought her scraps, a ribbon, a broken silver spoon, a bowl with one chip. She would press them into easy use, and when someone came by she would wrap them in a square of linen and tell a small, quiet story that seemed to make the gifts larger than they were. Her husband, Daniel Mercer, kept a different sort of house. He was a man who knew numbers in the way some men know prayer. His hands could check a ledger and make sense of a debt like a farmer reads soil. He had, too, a mouth for the tables where men gathered after the day's work. People said he was born with luck. Others said he had an appetite for risk the way some cows have an appetite for salt. A coin seemed to jolt him alive the way cold did a horse. When there were neighbors enough at the table and a bottle passed down to ease the day's ache, Daniel's laugh grew loose and loud.
He would talk about farm markets, about a plan to buy a cow or a length of cloth, about a scheme that for a moment made his eyes bright. Anna watched him with the steady, patient vigilance of someone who has lived with another's temper long enough to catalog it, his good heart, his blind spots, his reckless tenderness. Ashford in winter was stitched together by small economies of trust. Men worked fields and barns, but they also kept time in the tavern with cards and whiskey and the fiddle in the corner. Women met at the church annex to braid wreaths and to mend, bringing their needlework and their gossip alike. On Sundays, the congregation gathered, and the pastor read from passages that spoke of charity and humility. The words clung to coats and hats as people left, more like a thought than a law. There were immigrants among them, folk who had crossed oceans in the memory of a year, and they had brought with them other winter ways, the setting of a small fir tree near the hearth, the placing of bread with the salt on a plain wooden table. Carols hummed softly while hands pressed dough. These customs made an ordinary Sunday smell of spice, and the town took it in as if it were a new kind of weather. The season had been lean. Snow had kept the cart roads closed in recent weeks, and the county men who passed through town were fewer. The mill up by the river was below its usual run because the wheel had been caked by ice, and the miller was nursing a cough that had been for a fortnight. That all meant coin moved like a slow stream, trickling, careful, guarded. When money tightened, people began to measure kindness by different standards, by who was willing to share wood from their own pile, by who would take in a stray lamb for the night, by who would give a measure of flour when the pantry ran thin. The town's ledger was not only written in ink. On the evening that would press itself into talk for years, the town hall, the building with a porch bowed by snowfall and a sign that creaked in wind, was lit by lanterns. A modest supper had been set. Neighbors had brought what they could. There was a fiddle tucked in the corner of the room, a pile of chairs pushed against the far wall, and a plain pine table that had seen many hands. It smelled of dust and roast meat and the faint medicinal tang of camphor from a chest in which the pastor's wife kept winter remedies. Men and women drifted in, wrapped in coats stiff with salt and snow, removing boots with the practiced motion of people who'd learned to make much of little. At one end of the room, the card table stood away from the supper, like a separate altar. The lamp above it threw a hard circle of light, and the cards, old, soft at the edges, took on a kind of reverence. Men pulled their chairs close, easing into a ritual that was as much about speaking in ways they could not at the family table as it was about coins.
When Daniel Mercer took his seat, his hands were pale and steady from a day of ledger work. He smiled into the glass of whiskey, his eyes going to the doorway where Anna had come and gone earlier in the evening, mending a torn cuff on the minister's coat. He'd kissed her forehead at the door before he left. She had held him for a breath and told him, in that low voice women use when they want to guard a man from himself, to be careful. The game at the table began with jokes and small stakes, an egg here, a pocketful of tobacco there. Laughter loosened the air, and for a while the room breathed easy. The soldiers who had come through on their way to quarters sat at one table, nodding to the tune of the fiddle when it started. The pastor stood at the door talking to the schoolmaster about a boy who had been caught in a neighbor's cornfield. They both had the patient, weary look of men who measure their lives in small inconveniences. Still, when evenings like this gather together, there is a certain physics to them. A game gains heat. A coin's worth will become a wager becomes a promise, and a promise can heat the chest until a man forgets what he knows. Daniel's tongue grew warm. He spoke of a debt that had been left unpaid, of a batch of flour hoped for. His words were casual at first, the kind of casual meant to lay a ladder between a wish and the world. One good hand, and we'll eat honest for a fortnight. The men around him toasted and pushed back their chairs. The whiskey made every plan bigger. By the time the lamp had burned down to a stub and the fiddle had been set aside for a chorus of off-key singing, the stakes had changed. A man from along the river, Cooper Briggs, had been at the table for hours, his voice hoarse from laughter and his trousers stained with flour. He was the sort to laugh at the expense of others. Across from him was Jonas Pike, a man whose face had the Puritan calm of a man who counted sins instead of pennies. No one's sure why he had come to the game that night. They played and coins moved, and at one moment Daniel leaned forward. There was a tightness in his jaw that hadn't been there at supper. It was then, half a jest, half a despair, that the words came. A man's thought loses its shape where the lamp is brightest. Daniel's hand slid a coin forward. He looked at Cooper with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and said loud enough for the nearest to hear, "All right then. If I lose, you take." He gave a kind of small, brittle laugh, as if the jest would make the room forgive him. "If I lose, I'll give you what I can't pay with silver." There was a pause, the way the world takes a breath after a misstep. The men at the table glanced up. The fiddler's tune stuttered and fell silent in the next room. The soldiers, mid-sentence, looked at one another. Nobody said at first what the stake was, because the sentence had not yet grown legs. It had hung for the room to name.
Cooper, reaching for his drink, cocked an eyebrow. Jonas ran his thumb along the rim of the tobacco pouch. The card players inched their chairs closer, not wanting to miss whatever shape the wager might take. Then, because Daniel felt to say it was better than not saying anything, and because the whiskey had loosened a draft of recklessness in him, he finished the sentence. "If I lose," he said more plainly, "I'll give you Anna." The lamp threw the word up like a white flag. For a moment, the room forgot to breathe. It is worth saying plainly what every honest person in that room immediately understood. The words were a slip, cruel and absurd. A man cannot properly bet another's life any more than he can bet the weather. But when words are thrown into a room where people are tired and the law is a rope the small cannot always climb, they do not remain mere words for long. The faces of those near the table changed. Some lips curled into chokes, others into disgust. A child, who had come in to fetch a forgotten mitten, stood at the doorway with a hand to his mouth and watched. Anna, who had come into the hall for a moment to bring a second helping of stew, stood in the doorway at that sound. She had her shawl wrapped tight. There was a smear of flour on her sleeve from the pot lid she had set down in the kitchen. People often saw Anna as the steady constant, the sort whose life told as much as she could of goodness. But the thing about steady people is their reserves. They have the power to shock as much as any sudden fire. She walked to the table. There are many ways a woman can be met, with pity, with joke, with a look that pretends not to see that the world has called her name as if it were merchandise. Anna came forward in a manner that made no performance of anger and no dramatic speech. Her gait was simple. The candlelight made a soft shadow under her chin. The men at the table fell quiet in a room that had only lately been full of jokes and warmth. It felt as if a pane of glass had been set up between the night and the people there. Everyone could see through it now. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was steady. "You will not speak that way." The words were small but precise. They were the kind of words a person uses when correcting an error in a ledger, firm, precise, and without flourish. There was an unexpected hush. Daniel's face flushed. His hand, still warm from the glass, trembled. He opened his mouth, perhaps to laugh it off, perhaps to take back the foolishness. But the room had changed. The men who had been leaning forward relaxed or straightened, and Cooper, who had been expecting drama, did not get the kind he thought he had bought. "You don't mean it," Cooper said, trying to gather the straight courage of a man who deals in insults like one counts coins. "I jest, Daniel. Lighten up. I've known you to tell worse tales." It was not a jest, Anna said, and the weight of her tone made the card table feel small.
You will not trade me like an article. I will not be set as a stake in men's folly. She had the right, more than the right. She had a claim upon her own life, and every sentence she gave it. A man at the back muttered about propriety. The pastor, who had been standing by the door, stepped forward. He had the look of someone who measures his words before speaking them, and yet that night's sermon was inside of him like a coal. He could not let such a thing go unrebuked. "This talk is beneath a town's dignity," he said. "We do not set people like wares upon a bench." The men at the table shuffled their feet. Daniel's laugh had become a thin thing. He had never intended to humiliate his wife. He only thought to buy himself time, another round, another chance. When men gamble the things they love, sometimes what they mean is to make themselves appear larger, to make a risk feel like courage. Yet courage and recklessness are cousins, and men in recklessness often wound other people to hide the bruise of their own shame. "You're tired, Daniel," Anna said. "Sit down. We will speak in the morning. We have debts to settle, but not by giving what is another's." There was softness in her words that did not excuse his error. She had that curious, sharp tenderness that looks straight at a wrong and names it so it will not grow again. Daniel, who had for a moment believed he had only thrown down a coin, found that the room's judgment was something worse than money. It was the small, expanding sense that a man's honor could be undone by his own hand. At that heat, it would have been enough if the matter stayed between husband and wife, if a public rebuke tempered itself into an evening's quiet between a man and his conscience. But the world is often not so tidy. The town is like a tapestry. One tug and the whole thing shifts. The conversation at the table had already become a spectacle. A man not from Ashford, but from the ranches beyond the ridge, a man named Elias Crow, had come into the hall late, his boots heavy with dust, his coat smelling faintly of horse and saddle oil. The rancher was a large man, broad-shouldered, with the weathered skin of someone who slept under stars and who could read the land like a book. He had kept to himself mostly, trading his cattle when he did and speaking when it mattered. Tonight he had come with a small parcel for the pastor, a pair of leather gloves mended, and a hand a child had wrapped in a square of cloth. Elias stood a few feet from the card table, leaning on his palm, as if the room itself were a comfortable thing to lean upon. He watched Daniel with the slow, patient eyes of a man who had learned to watch storms pass and to measure which houses stood firm. When Anna stepped forward and spoke, Elias's face did not shift into the fierce look men sometimes take when they wish to protect, as if possession were the same as care. Instead, his jaw tightened with something like a tally being made.
"Enough," Elias said, softly at first, then with a voice that carried over the table. The room took on the hush of a winter field at midday. This is not how folk in a decent place talk of one another. Cooper, who liked to press a point until someone bled truth or coin, tried to laugh. "Who says? The rancher? You got a mind for telling us how to run a town, Crow?" Elias's laugh did not travel. He pushed back from the wall and walked toward the table. His boots made a sound on the floorboards that cut through the low chatter. When he stopped, he stood squarely across from Daniel, a measure like a man's shoulders against the cold. The light threw a shadow from his nose across his mouth. and his hands, calloused in a way that did not make people afraid, but made them expect plainness, were empty. "She'll not be put up as what you named," Elias said, and then, in words that would be repeated with a dozen different inflections in the years to come, he voiced what he had decided. "She's mine now." The sentence landed not as a purchase, but as an offer, not as a deed of chattel, but as a public pledge that the man would not tolerate the town turning a woman into an item to be passed like a cup. There is a difference between claiming someone as property and claiming them as a person one will defend. Elias's tone carried the latter. He made it plain in his posture and in the way his voice did not look for thanks. He did not say it to own Anna. He said it to stop the violence of thought. A clamor rose then, more surprised than angry, for no one had expected such bluntness. Some thought Elias intended to buy Daniel out, to pay his debt, and remove Anna like a favor. Others suspected he aimed to shame Daniel into better behavior. Daniel stood up straighter, his face red, the color of a man who realizes the table has been placed between himself and the world. "You cannot take her," Daniel spat, the word coming out like a coin dropped on a hard surface. "No one can simply—" "Who says I take?" Elias interrupted. "I say I will not see a woman stripped of her name while men with coin laugh it away. If I need to pay what you owe to settle this, I will, or else I'll see that the town keeps to its duty. But I will not have you make your wife into a wager." Daniel looked like a man who had been stripped of a lie. The crowd shifted, and the pastor's face was grave. The soldiers leaned forward, fingering the straps of their belts. The children at the back, who had been told to sit and be still, exchanged glances like dominoes ready to fall. Anna stood between Daniel and the rest. By custom, she might have stayed small. Women often shrank in public when a man's pride needed space. But she did not. She spoke few words, but they were chosen as carefully as a stitch. "I will not be given or taken," she said. "If help is offered, I will hear what it is. I will not be the thing that makes a man's shame vanish."
The clarity of her statement surprised Daniel as much as it did the room. For a long second, no one moved. Then Cooper spoke, trying to salvage the evening with bravado, but his voice was softer, as if he'd been hit by the wind. "We were jesting," he said. "No harm meant." "There was harm meant even if you meant none," Anna answered. "Words are not innocent in a room that is small." Elias's hand, calloused and large, rested lightly on the back of an empty chair. He did not push forward. He did not make the kind of show that men often make when they wish to claim a prize. He had not come to own, he had come to make a stand, public and blunt, against a slur on a woman's personhood. That act alone changed the evening's chemistry. "It will be looked to," the pastor said then, voice low and official. He was not a man to take the law into his own hands, but he was a man who believed a town must hold its members to a common code. "If there's redress to be had, we will seek it. People will be called to account." For now, the moment held like a breath held between two tides. Some men in the room shifted their weight as if to leave, others remained, as if waiting for the next chord. Daniel's face had the crumpled look of a man aware he had been shown his true measure. He glared at Elias for a heartbeat, and then his eyes slid to Anna. There was something like shame there, which is only man's small mercy. He sat down with the sound of a man who has been unmasked. "No more cards," he said, and the room, as if admonished, obliged. The men left coins on the table like small, somber offerings, and folded their hands into their sleeves as if that would hide the color in their cheeks. The fiddler took up a song, but the tune was different now, quieter, a little uncertain, the melody that men and women sing as they try to stitch a tear they did not mean to make. After a while, as candles burned low and the last of the supper was cleared, people drifted back to their own houses. They walked home with their coats buttoned against the air, and the town went in its slow way from outrage to rumor to the private conversations that people will have only in the safe dark of their own kitchens. The story of that night grew, as such stories do. Some said Elias had purchased Anna to free her. Others said he had simply offered to back Daniel's debts so that no man would claim another. Still others thought he had done nothing at all but speak an honest sentence. Facts in small towns are often expected to serve moral lessons. The truth does not always align with the lessons people wish to learn. Anna walked home with Daniel. The snow had softened to a fine powder that wrapped itself around their feet and left a faint dusting on their shoulders. The walk was quiet. Daniel kept his head down. He did not try to touch her hand as they passed under a street lamp, and that in itself is speech. At the gate, Anna stopped and turned to him.
She was tired, and there was an exhaustion in her eyes that came from the day's labors and from the small wars she had to fight just to be named rightly. "You will make amends," she said.
Not for me alone, Dan, for yourself. You will find a way to repair the harm your words have done." He said nothing for a moment, and then, finally, "I will," he murmured. The word held a kind of brittle apology, the beginning of the work that a man must do when he has been shown to have erred. Elias walked back toward the ridge, his boots leaving a long, measured track across the snow. He passed Reverend Tully, who stood at his gate, watching the world like a man who keeps an inner ledger of wrongs and rightings. "You did well to speak," the pastor said, in a voice that was softer because it had miles of thought behind it. Elias did not answer with the kind of modesty that claims no shape. He only folded his hands in front of him and said, "A town must know what it will not be." And the town, in those early hours of night, studied that sentence like a new rule. It was, for many, a small comfort that someone had stood up in public to rebuke a wrong. For others, it was an unasked-for storm. If this quiet winter pulls at you, like and subscribe for more stories like this. The days that followed were not neat. People spoke in corners and remembered details as if they were evidence. Some called Daniel a man undone by pride. Others whispered that Anna might take the offer, if there was anything in it beyond talk. Men openly avoided the card tables for a week, and when they returned, they played with the low, false cheer of men who watch a scar and are not sure how it will look after the frost melts. The pastor wrote a note asking the church council to consider a small fund for families in need. They would meet and decide what resourcing meant in a winter such as this. Elias visited the Mercers, offering, without fanfare, to take on Daniel's debt to Cooper Briggs, if that would smooth things with the men who had been hurt by the wager. He brought no coin in his hand, but a plan measured in practicalities. "I'll take what Daniel owes and pay it off in small sums across this year," he said when they sat at Anna's kitchen table, where the kettle hissed and the light was dim. "Or I'll stand with you at the town meeting. I will not have folk think it's a jest." Daniel's face was reddened with a shame that made him look nearly older than he was. He had, in the days after, tried to reassert himself with a promise to make right, but his promises felt thin. Elias's offer, however, carried weight, not because it made the debt vanish, but because it acknowledged that the attempt to treat a person as a stake had been wrong. Anna listened, and when Elias had said what he meant, she looked at Daniel and then spoke for herself in a manner that made it plain she would not be content to be a prize swept in a tide of men's choices. "I thank you for your kindness," she told Elias.
If you mean to help, do so the town need not place another soul on the table. But know this, I will not be taken as an answer to a man's mistake. If I am to leave, it will be my choosing. If I stay, it will be for reasons of my own." Elias inclined his head. There was no possessive tone in his reply. "I hear you." He looked at Daniel, then returned his gaze to Anna. "You will have a place to keep your things if you wish it. A room at our place is not a purchase. It's shelter if you need it." Anna's eyes flashed, not with gratitude alone, but with the sight of options, something that in hard winters tastes like relief. To the people who made up Ashford, the offer looked like a rescuer's chest open at a storybook moment. To Anna, it was a handing over of agency, which she accepted only on the terms she could set. Daniel, who listened to this exchange, had a low, small sound in his throat, a sound that could have been remorse or the beginning of a man finding his feet. He promised, in words that were thin but perhaps honest, that he would ask the town for help in a way that would condemn his folly without condemning his wife. The town, for all its talk, had a sense of fairness. It also had a taste for public drama. The council would meet. People would have opinions. Between the two of them, the decisions were not yet sealed. Anna turned toward her larder, toward the little things she carried close, the dolls, the mended linens, the recipe cards in a pencil-worn book. She was someone who had always made a home out of small acts. Now she met the bigger question, whether those acts would continue in the pattern they had been, or whether a new seam had begun to show. There were nights when Daniel sat at the table and looked at the marks that his hand had made on a world he had loved. He tried to count his errors in the flicker of the candle. He tried to be the sort of man who fixes his misdeeds with work and time and humility.
And there were nights when Anna, who had been humiliated in a room that was meant to be neighborly, felt a cold that the hearth could not touch, the chill of being named as thing rather than person. She was, after all, a woman who loved small mercies. She also loved that each mercy be given rightly. In the days that followed, the story of a wager and of a rancher's declaration grew teeth. Men at the tavern argued whether Elias was the better man or simply the louder. Women at the church kitchen spoke of the rightness of saying one's name. Children inscribed the words on the snow with sticks. The pastor wrote to a friend in the next county, asking if any record existed of similar occurrences, for it was, he thought, an instruction in how communities must guard against treating people as currency. For all that, the truth remained. The town had been forced to look at itself. A small town's sense of itself is held in the way it answers such tests.
Some would counsel forgiveness for a man who had erred in drink and pride. Others would say that a public rebuke should hold consequence. What no one could do was make the moment unremembered. The end had not come. There was still talk of what restitution could mean. There were plans, half-formed, a parish meeting to arrange payment, an offer of work at the ranch for Daniel so he might rebuild law with his own hands, a promise that the pastor would ask the council to censure the kind of behavior that turned people into stakes. Yet Anna remained the fulcrum. No one could, in truth, decide for her what would honor her most, staying in a house with a husband who had publicly demeaned her but sought to repair that wrong, or taking Elias up on an offer that would be shelter and possibility. The snow fell, and the town carried the quiet of the event like an ancient bruise. People rounded the corners of their days with new caution. At Anna's hearth, the embers glowed in the same color they had before. The bread still rose, and the stew kept its bright fat. Yet there was a thread running through the small domestic things, a sense that words could do more harm than a winter's cold, and that standing up in public sometimes changes the shape of a life not by taking it, but by defending it. And so life went on, slow and measured, at the pace of seasons. The story of a man who in a weakened hour had spoken an ill thing, of the woman who refused to be bartered, of the rancher who declared he would defend her dignity, sat like a stone in the town's center. People touched it in their minds when they passed the meeting house, or set a footstep different on the way to the market. Town meetings would be called. Men would have to decide whether to accept a loan, a pledge, or the more awkward work of apology. Men who gambled would find their tables smaller of late. The pastor would preach of humility, and the miller would cough through his work. But in one small kitchen, at night, Anna folded over a patch in a child's collar with a needle that moved like a metronome. Her fingers worked with an old steadiness, and once the stitch was pulled tight, she set the needle down and looked out the window at the pale world. Her reflection in the glass was small and certain. She did not yet decide the day's end. She had a mind to choose for herself. That had become the new measure. Outside, Elias Crow rode back across the ridge toward the wide open of his ranch. His silhouette against the snow was a dark cut of a man who keeps his land and keeps watch. He had said his words in the hall, and he knew the risk of bearing the weight of a town's expectations. He had not come as a savior with keys and a free bed. He had come as a person willing to state, plainly, that a town should not let a woman be set on a table. That, as far as he could see, was sometimes the most a man could do, to name the wrong and to refuse to let the world accept it. The moment when the community would decide what that refusal meant was still to come. The votes, the meetings, the offers would follow, some gentle, some fraught, and each would carry the possibility of repair or of deeper wound. For now, though, the night's work lay like ash. People would warm their hands at their own hearts and go to bed with a sense of the place they belonged. The snow would disguise footprints by morning, and the town would wake to jobs and to chores, and to the small ways of survival. But a seed was planted. A woman had said she would not be wagered. A man had spoken his refusal to accept that, and the town had been forced to look. Those things would not soon be undone. What would you have done in Anna's place? If this story moved you, leave one line about what standing up means to you.
and subscribe to follow more Midnight Tales. The week that followed moved like a slow thaw. Snow still lay heavy in the hollows, but the bad weather of the heart had been named, and people were learning how to carry that naming without breaking. The meeting house filled on a gray morning with a hush that had nothing to do with cold. Men took off their caps and kept them folded in their hands. Women settled their shawls and looked at one another as if they were mapping where courage might be found. The pastor had asked for the council to convene. He insisted that what had happened could not be allowed simply to puff away on rumor. A town is not defined by what it tolerates, he said, and his breath made a small cloud as he spoke. Elias Crow sat near the back, as he had the night before, a shape like a man who belonged to wide places rather than crowded rooms. Daniel Mercer sat near the door, pulled in on himself. Anna sat at the long oak with a folded handkerchief at her side. The council took its time. There were matters of corn measures and a schoolhouse shutter to consider, but the day's business bent toward what must be said publicly. Men and women rose to speak not only of the specifics of Daniel's wager, but of the larger thing it had revealed, the ease with which some may, for a moment of bravado or desperation, reduce another human being to a line item. Cooper Briggs, who was as much a part of the town's fabric as the mill wheel, had not come at first. When he did arrive, his presence as abrupt as a gust through a door, faces turned. He was a man used to playing in a room where words were traded like coins and where a laugh could cover a sting. Yet, as he stood before the board and the gathered townspeople, his throat had a hardness to it that made the pastor think of people who swallow pride for reasons that are not only conscience but necessity. "I meant nothing by it," Cooper said. His voice was steady, but the color had gone from his cheek. "I was in the company of men, and men say things they're not to be proud of." "Words like that," the pastor replied, "leave marks on people whether any coin is laid down or not."
Cooper's jaw worked. If Daniel wishes restitution, if there's coin owed, I'll take the town's say. I was not the one to demand the thing be named that way, and if my laugh made a wound, I will see it accounted. It was not exactly contrition, not the whole folding down of a man into repentance, but it was something like the beginning of being made small enough to repair. The council, after patient deliberation, decided to recommend a public apology be made by those at the table and to offer a small fund, gathered from donations, to ease Daniel's immediate debt. The pastor suggested that Cooper might accept a few weeks' work from Daniel, an arrangement in which both man and town could see what mending might look like. That way, the ledger of harm could be paid with labor, and the labor of repairing character could be visible. The choice offered a practical path forward, a way that did not depend on one man buying another or on a woman's fate being traded like a good. It was exactly the kind of solution a small town prefers, finances and public words braided together so that the repair becomes communal. Elias, when asked, offered to underwrite a part of the fund and to take on Daniel for work at the ranch until such time as the debt might be paid. He made it clear he would not do so to own anyone, but to ensure that the next time a man felt the need to turn his household into bargaining stock, the town had done its part to hold him to better measures. Anna listened to all of it, and when the room had been given its say, she stood. Her hands smelled faintly of soap and lard, and all the domestic labors that make a life habitable. She had not come to the meeting to be paraded as a piece of evidence. She had come because the question concerned her name and the terms upon which she would continue. "I am grateful the town will not let this pass," she said, and each word fell as if she placed it carefully into a dish. "But I must speak plain. I do not want coin as substitute for a man's apology. I do not want to be the token by which my husband's shame is washed away. If there is to be restitution, let it be such that the harm is repaired by work and by words offered in a way that honors the dignity of all involved." The council nodded. The pastor's eyes were wet at the corner. Daniel had sunk back into his seat and would not look at her. The measure of a man's shame is often that his eyes cannot meet the necessities of repair. She continued, and the room fell again into that tannic hush. "If Elias offers shelter or work," Anna said, "I will accept only on terms I make. Shelter that is a hand extended is different from shelter that is a hand closing. If I am to leave, it will be my choice. If I stay, it will be because Daniel has done the work of reweaving what he has torn. Her stipulations were not a demand for drama. They were the sober arithmetic of a woman who had been named wrongly in public and wished to reassert the sovereignty of her life.
The pastor offered to write a letter to be kept on record, a note that the town had convened, that the offense had been acknowledged, and that the measures for restitution had been sent. It was small but formal, an assurance that the matter was held, not swept aside. In the days after the meeting, the town found its rhythms again, but the edges were sharper. Daniel began his tenure at Elias's ranch, walking away from the Mercer's lot with the feeling of a man who had been made newly accountable. It was not an easy work for any of them. Elias, who kept cattle and fences and weathered days, could be taciturn but exacting. "You will learn there is dignity in a hand that does right," he told Daniel on the first morning, his voice like a plow cutting through old sod. "If you earn what you owe, you will learn the measure of your words." Daniel took the work. There was good in his labor, long days that left him with honest exhaustion and the kind of tiredness that encourages reflection. He rose before dawn, fed horses, mended fence, and in the evenings walked the narrow miles back to a house where a woman he loved had had her name laid bare to a room full of witnesses. Sometimes, late at night, he sat with his head in his hands and tried to name for himself why he had said what he had. Guilt is an instrument with many tones. Daniel learned its music in the creak of a gate and the ache of a back. Cooper, for his part, did as the council had asked. He accepted a certain measure of payment from the fund and the promise of labor from Daniel. He did not parade contrition. Instead, he found himself quieter in company, less ready with the jeer. In a small town, the smallest penance can teach more than sermon. Children were allowed to overhear men learning to be less. The tavern tables were filled less often by the sorts of wagers that traded in humiliation. Anna, meanwhile, began to chart possibilities she had not let herself own before. She had always been resourceful, a seam maker, a preserver, a woman who could make a doll with 3 stitches and a thread of humor. But resourcefulness does not always equal independence in a place where people follow the patterns of custom. The events of the card table had given her a sharp new steer. She would not consent to be moved as someone else's answer to shame. She would also not be without a plan. The pastor and a few women of the church convened a small circle to see what good work might be done. They had, in their time, made quilts for the winter, stitched mittens for boys in the cold, and set aside a small sum from the Sunday plate when needs pressed. This time, they proposed a modest enterprise, a community table of mending and small goods. Women would take in repairs and make toys and sewn goods to sell at the market in the next town over when the roads thawed. The earnings would be split, a part toward the small fund for those in hardship, a part for the hands that made the goods, and a small reserve for a widow or a mother who needed the bread when the mill's wheels slowed. Anna accepted a place at that table, not because she needed the money most, but because it would be a place where her labor could be seen on its own terms. "I will sow," she told the pastor, "but let our work be a thing of giving as well as earning. Let it be such that a woman can come and learn and not be made into a story." The group met in the church annex, a room warmed by a tight stove and lit by 2 clear windows that looked over the square. The smell of steamed cloth and boiled wool became its own weather. Hands that had once mended only for kin now taught younger women how to run a stitch true and tight. They made rugs, mittens, and small, sturdy dolls out of scraps, faces stitched with patience rather than paint, hair made from leftover yarn. The market at the next town, when the thaw opened the road, took their goods not only for their usefulness, but for the quiet reputation of the women who had made them. There is a dignity in work made and then given to the town's circulation. It is a different kind of chorus than the one men sing with wagers. Anna's handiwork carried a name and a signature, a small woven tag that said Ashford in old-fashioned thread. People began to buy not only for the object, but for the tale that came with it, that these were things made by hands that knew a wrong and chose to make right by labor. Days lengthened. The sun sat higher above the ridge. The errands that used to be passed from house to house began to hum again. At night, Anna and Daniel ate at the same table as they had before, but this time with a practice of speaking plainly across the bowl. It was not a neat seam. There were times when his guilt clung like a wet coat he could not shake. There were moments when she would return from the annex with a new stitch learned, and his pride would be tested by the sight. They talked differently. He listened in a way he had not done before, and he did the sort of work that cannot be faked. He showed up. Elias kept his part, though in a way that was perfectly unspectacular. He would smile at Anna across the square, nod to Daniel when he came to fetch a tool, and keep his offers modest and practical. He helped arrange for a wagon full of feed to be carried to the Mercers in late February when the weather threatened the animals. He did not parade the help or call for outward thanks. It is the manner of some men to make justice quietly, like mending a hedge in the night so the morning finds it whole. Not all the wounds healed evenly. Rumor, which thrives in the slight of a lowered voice, persisted for weeks. Some said Anna had been rescued. Others said she had been won by a rancher. Words like these are elastic and dangerous.
The women in the annex made it their business to speak plainly when such misgivings arose. "There is no buying of a person," one of them said. Martha, who had lost a husband to the fever 3 winters past, and who ran her house like a small fortress of candor. "There is only the choosing to help or not. We will teach what choosing looks like." At Easter, when the thaw had fully come and the first crocuses pushed their brave faces through the last of the snow, the town gathered again. This time the talk was not only of restitution, but of precedent. How would they handle similar wrongdoings? The pastor proposed a small binding practice. When a man of the town did harm by words or action, there would be a public accounting that included an apology, a labor pledge, and a community-made plan for remedy. It was humble, but it meant that people would not be made tokens of a man's vanity, nor would the cost of repair fall only on those who could not speak for themselves. Daniel stood before that gathering and made his apology in plain fashion. He did not make it theatrical. He spoke of his weakness, of shame, and of the slow, necessary work he intended to do. "I will not ask Anna to accept my word alone," he said. "I will ask this town to hold me to it. If I fail, let that failing be visible so I can repair again." It was not a grand absolution, but it was accountability made public, which, in a small place, is often as near to justice as one can get. The crowd, some nodding, some with the memory still fresh of the card table, received him with guarded warmth. Cooper shook his hand in public, and the 2 men stood there like 2 figures who might yet be neighbors again. Anna watched all of this the way one watches the shape of a bread rise, with a careful eye and a reserve of hope. She had made a choice, not a dramatic flight from one man's arms to another's, but the slow building of options. She accepted the work at the annex and took in mending and some of the market's goods. She accepted a kind of shelter in the knowledge that she would have a place to keep her things should the path she chose ever require distance. None of this was purchased with dramatic gestures. It was purchased with the small, stubborn currency of respect and agreement. Seasons turned. Spring's first rains were the sound of a town washing itself in small mercies. The churchyard bleached from gray to green. The Mercer's house, once an epicenter of rumor, became a place where neighbors came and left, and where the rhythm of ordinary life, dishes washed, a fire banked, a doll sewn, returned. Daniel continued at the ranch. He learned to mend what fences could be mended. He learned slowly to choose his words with the same care he once arranged ledger entries. He found that craft and contrition do not cancel out what was said, but they can become the path on which a man walks away from what he was.
She thought of the way a stitch binds 2 halves, of the town stitches, public apology, labor, charity, that had been set in motion to hold people steady when they tripped. She thought of the freedom that came from agency, from the right to choose one's place. It was a quiet thought, but an important one. Outside, a child ran past the window, trailing a length of ribbon and laughing at the cold. A neighbor called good night. The snow kept falling, laying down its hush like a promise. The town would have other tests, other days when people's faults would be thrown wide by drink or despair. But the memory of that card table would stand as an instructive ember, small, persistent, and enough to light the way for those who would not let a person be wagered as if she were a thing. What would you have done in Anna's place? Leave one line about what standing up means to you, and if this story sat with you,
Subscribe to follow more midnight tales and quiet reckonings.